On today's World Inside, two diplomatic tracks toward an end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, one hosted by Saudi Arabia only between Washington and Moscow, and the other in France among European powers. How would these two tracks likely play out, and how does China figure in these approaches to the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian. The Russian-Ukraine conflict enters its fourth year in February. On Tuesday, the United States and Russia had a bilateral meeting in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, without Kyiv and its European allies. According to media reports, Russia and the United States also agreed to take efforts toward a path to ending the conflict in Ukraine. Meanwhile, European leaders met in Paris for a summit on Ukraine and regional security. It came at a time when Europeans are grappling with an apparent transatlantic rift. On this and more, I talked to Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, a senior fellow of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University, who recently spoke at the Munich Security Conference. Hear his assessment of the latest different approaches by Washington and European capitals on the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, what a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Now we see two tracks going on parallel about the Russian-Ukraine crisis. One is between the U.S. Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The other is in Paris among leaders of European capitals talking about the security of Europe. What do you make of these parallel tracks?
That is a very interesting comparison because, first of all, the United States definitely has more cards to play, and they are talking to Russia. So we should expect that this one might be more fruitful. But for the other one you mentioned, actually Europeans will insist that they have to be involved in a war that is occurring in the heart of Europe. So therefore they have their own agenda. And the worst fear of Europe, including Ukraine, is to be kept out of this process. So to see these two going on parallel, I just wonder when they might just overlap.
How much expectation do you see Washington today, especially the Trump administration, will be having the interest of the European capitals and Ukraine in mind when having a discussion with Russia?
He won't care too much about what Europeans really think about this issue, but definitely this is one of his top priorities, because even during election he talked about how he will be able to resolve this issue within 24 hours, which of course is not true, right? But since he has made this pledge, and this pledge is simply too impressive, so definitely it will be his priority, and he does have leverage on both sides, because he could talk to Russia. If you won't stop, then I'll just provide more assistance to Ukraine, and he could talk to Ukraine that if you won't stop, then I will just not provide an assistance to you. So the United States certainly would have more leverage, but actually this would be one of the most difficult issues for the United States as well. So I think the war will still last for a while until they would try to find a kind of solution. Trump talked about the war must come to a stop and negotiation must follow. So this actually is putting the cart before the horse, because all people, even United Nations sometimes, would be politically correct to talk about immediate ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire, but no ceasefire is unconditional, right? It's always a result of negotiations. So you have to negotiate first, but then for Ukrainians, the worst fear is, okay, should there be a ceasefire one day, who is going to guarantee the ceasefire? Yeah, in facing with such a once superpower, right? So this is this intrinsic fear of Ukrainians. Therefore, that is why Zelensky has been talking about a collective security guarantee. I really like this idea, because I believe in this kind of collective security guarantee, China definitely will be there.
In the meeting one-on-one between the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and also the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, the Chinese Foreign Minister did mention on the sideline of the Munich Security Conference about the importance China played so far in the United Nations peacekeeping, not only as a major player in sending the number of troops, but also in providing the funding for UN peacekeeping in the world. Now, how much do you think China's earlier experiences would prepare China for a possible role, as you just mentioned? Earlier, you've been in the PLA in charge of peacekeeping and certainly seen some of the major events of peacekeeping that eventually bring successful results.
This is a very complicated question, but my answer to you is very simple. Because I believe, as I have written in my article for Foreign Affairs in 2017, China is a unique country which has combined the three elements in peacekeeping. That is a strong political determination, well-disciplined soldiers, and good equipment. You see, when it comes to African countries, they have political will, but they don't have a good equipment, and they are not necessarily disciplined, right, sometimes. And then when we come to European countries, they have good equipment, they have qualified people, but they do not have a strong political will. Let me compare Chinese efforts and American efforts, right? I remember at least 5 or 6 years ago, China has about 2,500 to 3,500 peacekeepers around the world. It depends on, which mission they are, because during Trump's first term, there were about 16 peacekeeping missions. Now there are only 11. So this figure simply changes. But at that time, United States only have 58 people involved in peacekeeping. That's not to say that the United States is not active in peacekeeping, because American contribution comes first as the largest donor for fund of peacekeeping, and they would actually train more people on site in Africa. So that is their way of contribution. But China certainly has sent more troops in training the local people and in the physical presence in these peacekeeping missions, which are mostly found in Africa.
Is that going to be a gesture if China's future role will be carved in a way regarding peacekeeping on issues between Russia and Ukraine crisis?
For peacekeeping to happen, it needs the consent of warring parties. But in this case, would Russia agree to peacekeeping or not? I'm not so sure. But if you look at the world, the sad thing is, now the world definitely needs more peacekeeping missions, right? Yeah, having disaster here and there. But sometimes they just cannot decide, even by themselves. For example, in Gaza, Gaza also needs peacekeeping, right? But then, would Israel agree to it? And then the thing is, on the other side, who would it be? Would it be Hamas? Israel would never agree. And would it be PA, Palestinian Authority? Maybe to some extent, but now we're
nowhere near there.
Now we are seeing President Trump talking about turning it into a kind of a tourist side, right?
What is China's understanding, do you see, Senior Colonel Zhou, from your perspective, about these parallel tracks? Is China having problems with it, or China would love to see any track have any results that can eventually contribute to peace?
I think the Chinese foreign minister has made it quite clear. We welcome any proposals that can lead to, kind of solutions that are balanced, fair to all. But the question is, if you can resolve this issue without China's help, that is totally fine. The real question is, can you really resolve it? Because Donald Trump even asked China to help. I think he subconsciously has realized how difficult this issue might be, right? And he certainly knows that China enjoys a good friendship with Russia. But at the same time, of course, China's relationship with Ukraine is also good.
You see, there are strong expectations coming from the Ukrainian side. You also heard from the Munich Security Conference, and earlier, different voices coming from Europe say China has such an impact and influence and role to play. And what is China's understanding of its own role?
I don't believe we need to exaggerate any proposals, including China's proposal. The thing is, unless until two warring parties want to come to a stop, no proposal will work. You see, China in very early stage has proposed a 12-point peace plan. And then China and Brazil have made a joint proposal. But China is not the only country that has made proposals. At the earliest stage, Italy is also one of them. So there are a lot of proposals flying around, right? Maybe, it's sad to say that, maybe when both sides become somewhat tired and do not want to continue fighting, then that is the time where your proposal might work. If, for example, China's joint proposal with Brazil, no matter how we think about it, the response from Ukrainian president is that it is destructive, right? So he could be wrong, and there could be another chance, when China can actually provide a kind of assistance. But first of all, you need these two guys fighting with one another to become cool-headed.
That's a good point. On the other hand, what is going to be China's relationship with Russia? We have been hearing that China and Russia are strategic partners, and China regards relationship with Russia as one of the most important bilateral relations it is looking at today. So how is China positioning its relationship with Russia vis-a-vis the backdrop of a Russian-Ukraine context?
You see, when I say that China and Russia must have a good relationship, being the largest neighbors toward each other, this of course is easily understood.
It's common sense.
But the problem is with China's growing strength, people actually have a lot of expectation for you. And because of the war there, those European countries just want you, to play an immediate role, almost like a panacea, Why don't you just pick up phone and tell President Putin to stop? And why just can't China stop providing economic assistance to Russia? Why just can't you stop providing spare parts that are dual use in nature? All these questions come.
Questions and accusations.
Yeah, but let me pick the last point. I always give people an example. For example, gas and oil. If I say this is gas and oil, you would not think much beyond that. But if I put this gas and oil into the tank of a military truck, it immediately becomes a military product, right? So this is why it could be dual used. But when something is dual use in nature, you have to assume, first of all, it is for civilian use. You cannot say it is just for military use, right? And between China and Russia, why not provide them assistance for this war? Actually, this kind of bilateral trade, in terms of the items, are very much like what we did before the war. The only change is that we are exporting more to them because they could not buy from Europe.
They were sanctioned.
Yeah, so that is the only reason. China certainly has maintained some bottom lines. For example, I remember very clearly in the Munich Security Conference in 2023, the former Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, talked about how he highly suspected that China would be providing or is providing military assistance to Russia.
He accused.
Yeah, he accused China. He was highly suspicious of that. It's almost like, accusing China is doing something. But then in his talk with BBC, he said China didn't do that, right? So that means China has some really serious bottom lines. And China has made a tremendous contribution by telling, people in Europe, including Russians, no use of nuclear weapons. This is a clear-cut policy that is welcomed by all European countries.
You were at the Munich Security Conference. Some media reports suggest there is an apparent strong rift of relations between Washington and also European capitals reflected there. However, there are also other reports, for example, mainly American media, talking about Munich Security Conference totally reflecting the fact there has been a lack of leadership in Europe and its inability, quote unquote, to come to consensus and not to mention actions. Now, how do you see this very diverse interpretation of the significance of this conference and this moment particularly?
The Europeans have lingering hope for the United States because the United States is a big brother, right? It's the head of the allies. So you can feel how Europeans feel sad or even angry about the remarks of J.D. Vance. But that actually would leave an opportunity for China and Europe to improve the Saudi relationship. The Saudi relationship is true because Europe has too much, expectation for you to play a role in the way that they like, and this is difficult for China. But even before J.D. Vance's speech, we're already seeing a kind of adjustment of European policy toward China. You were there in Davos. You have heard the remarks of Ursula von der Leyen. Ursula von der Leyen was widely regarded as the top China hawk on European continent, but her tone has softened down a bit, right? And I believe this Munich Security Conference will make Europe think further, about its relationship with China, and at least tactically speaking, they will make some changes. I read Gideon Rothman's report in Financial Times, and he wrote that a European diplomat simply told him, believe me, it's already happening.
But at the same time, we see quite an interesting reflection, if you look at the past few years, of chances of creating better ambience and even relationship between China and the European capitals, especially through the EU, but it did not happen. And therefore, do you see this is going to be another opportunity to be missed? Or is it more likely to be a real opportunity both sides under the current circumstances to think about the ways to deal with one another?
Well, I think from the Chinese side, our position has been made quite clear. Yeah, we just describe Europeans as partners, but the Europeans' description of China is a bit more complicated, system rival, economic partner, or challenge. So putting all this together, they don't know what they're talking about. Yeah, that is my conclusion. So maybe right now they would think China is more a kind of economic partner rather than this systemic rival, right? Yeah.
So they can pull out any card that they feel comfortable at the time.
They had 3 cards, right? And these cards would just confuse them.
And that also confuses China in terms of what ways how much to trust this counterpart.
Basically, you don't need to trust, for interactions, like during the Cold War. Yeah, we have, Soviet Union and the United States as absolute enemies, but they still would talk to one another, and they have even had some cooperation, for example, in 2 areas. One is joint efforts in eradicating smallpox, another is joint peaceful exploration of the outer space. So even enemies could cooperate sometimes out of a common fear, rather than trust. So why can't China cooperate with the United States? This relationship, according to the U.S., is but a relationship of competitors, right?
We see international relations, apparently, at least reflected by Washington, is becoming ever more transactional. And many wonder whether we're going to see the spread of this trend, even, for example, in the relations between Europe and China. Even though China has never believed in a transactional diplomacy, but how do you see this?
I think China should have no problem in making transactions with either Europe or United States. Why is that? Because China certainly has a different political system, but we are not exporting political system, right? The political system is for us, not for them. So what is left? of course, having good relationship and try to do as much business as possible. So in this area, it could be transactional. And
as China said, peace and prosperity.
Yeah, well, yeah, you can term it in that way, but China is the second largest economy by GDP and the largest economy by PPP. So China could have a lot of things, yeah, for trading. And likewise, be it United States or Europe, we can also have a lot of benefits or even trading from them. So this kind of relationship can be transactional. I don't believe it's a problem.
Senior Colonel Zhou, we noticed that during the speeches given by the Vice President of the United States and also the Defense Secretary, the newly elected, they put hard power, that phrase, into their speeches several times. Now, but on the other hand, we've been hearing from our European counterparts. They are suggesting a multilateral system, multilateralism, and also a multipolar world. So do you see a genetic difference in these two approaches? And where is China at this moment?
That's a good question. Well, when America talking about hard power, I believe that nobody, disagree about America's hard power. The question is about the soft power, right? And when it comes to Europe, because I have attended quite a few Munich Security Conference, I believe I have discovered some kind of differences between this year's Munich Conference and those in the past. In the past, for example, the themes of the conference in one year is called, is the international order falling apart? Apparently, this is a question. And then we have Westernlessness. The conclusion is so impressive. It argues that not only in the world is becoming less Western, but the West itself is becoming less Western. And then lose and lose, right? All these, Westernlessness and lose-lose are expression of emotions. But this year, the theme is multipolarization. It gives you a sense of direction, right? It tells you whether the world is moving forward. So I believe, Munich Security Conference is basically a Eurocentric conference. It has such a long history. So therefore, it looks at the world from a Western point of view, but even they themselves have to admit, now we have entered the world of multipolarization.
Now, moving on to another important issue in China's neighborhood, the South China Sea issue. Senior Colonel Zhou, you and I have been having this conversation about this issue for several times. The latest is some interesting exchanges you had with your American and the Filipino counterparts on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference. You asked your American counterpart if they are interested in the UNCLOS of the sea. What answer did you get?
Well, I will not call them my counterpart because I was just in the audience, but I did ask a question to the American senator when he talked about how for decades American Navy has been conducting freedom of navigation operations, which is true. But then I asked my question, if the UN Convention on Law of the Sea is so good.
Because the Americans usually quote on it, right?
Yeah. So if the UN Convention on Law of the Sea is so good, well, why don't you ratify it? But if it is not good, then why would you always challenge others in the name of it? And he immediately smiled, and he said he actually agree with me, because he said as a senator, he has been pushing for years, for the United States to ratify UN Convention on Law of the Sea.
So overall, the argument is, if the United States is not ratifying the UNCLOS, why would it use it as an argument for what China, as it considers, as doing wrong?
On this issue, it cannot be more obvious. I mean, Americans' double standard, right? So I have been interacting with my counterparts in the American military, and they would say, although they have not ratified it, but they are just doing it in the spirit of UNCLOS. Then why should you do it in the spirit of UNCLOS? Why don't you just ratify it and then do it, right? So it's just as simple as that. Because the United States is not only challenging China, but it is also challenging many other countries, more than a dozen countries. On what? On the so-called excessive maritime claims. Because U.S. Navy believe your claim over the sea is not in line with the UNCLOS.
Let me just read some of the headlines popular in the Western media about the South China Sea issue. Quote, China sends ships near U.S. ally in show of force. Or, quote, Philippine Coast Guard slams dangerous China helicopter maneuvers, and the list goes on. So when you see, Senior Colonel Zhou, given what you just said, these headlines, what is your response?
You see, basically South China Sea is peaceful. Every year there would be about 100,000 ships transiting through South China Sea. You won't have any complaint from these ships about any other countries impeding freedom of navigation. That is a fact. What you are talking about basically is this kind of a tension between China and the Philippines. And the reason behind, because the Philippines want to fortify the rusted ship that they have anchored on the Riyadh, or in English, Second Thomas Shoal. But in 1999, they actually promised to tow it away. But
was it on the record when they promised it?
Yeah, I think so. Because if you read China's white paper, I was very much aware of a term. They cited the so-called technical difficulties, right? Because it's quoted. So I'm sure the Chinese government can just provide a document. Yeah. Otherwise, how can the Chinese white paper quote something and put it in the white paper? So they did made the pledge, but of course they didn't honor the pledge. So that is why we have maybe 1,000, 2,000 Marine Corps soldiers of the Philippines staying on the ship for the last 25 years. But if China has not goodwill, how can these 2,000 soldiers stay on the ship for so long, right? So it is impossible, right? Right now, because of Mother Nature, the ship is becoming more and more rusted. So that is why they want to carry some cement to make it fortified, to turn it into a permanent base. And that is not something we would tolerate, because we believe this is Chinese territory.
But then, on the other hand, why would China tolerate that from the very beginning?
I think, so there are a number of reasons, but one of them is that China pledged in the declaration, in a joint declaration with ASEAN countries as early as 2002, not to use force to resolve any territorial disputes in the South China Sea. And how many people know that between such a major power like China and a small country called Philippines, it is the Filipino who actually have used force against Chinese? This happened in 2000, 2006, and 2013.
There were media reports, a lot of them about that.
They killed Chinese fishermen. So as a Chinese, I have to search my soul to ask myself this question. Since time immemorial, the Philippines has never been stronger than China, since time immemorial. So how come that the Filipino Coast Guards dare to kill Chinese time and again? As a Chinese, I have to ask myself this question. But people seem to have forget this. They just remember your water cannon.
Senior Colonel Zhou, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now, and I'll see you tomorrow.